First of all, new reports about additional images that the FBI has been able to obtain from Nancy Guthrie's surveillance cameras. Remember, we knew
things just took a shocking turn. Investigative reporter Brian Entin may have uncovered something major, and the internet is buzzing. Newly leaked CCTV footage is raising serious questions about Tommaso Cioni and what really happened behind the scenes. Join us in this video as we break down what the footage allegedly shows, why people believe this could put Cioni in serious trouble, and how Entin's latest move sparked a wave of reactions online. Is this the evidence everyone has been waiting for, or is there more to the story? Let's dive in and examine the details. Brian Entin reveals the strange discovery behind Nancy Guthrie's cameras. According to Brian Entin, one of the biggest developments in this case right now involves something investigators have been quietly working on for weeks: the surveillance cameras around Nancy Guthrie's home. Entin explained that this new information centers on images that were recently recovered from several cameras positioned around the property. And while this might not sound dramatic at first, he stressed that it could be a very important piece of the investigation. "We always knew Nancy had other cameras around the house," Entin said while discussing the update. "There were cameras on the side of the house and in the backyard near the pool. Those cameras had been part of the investigation from the beginning, but for a long time, it wasn't clear whether detectives would be able to pull anything useful from them." Entin revealed that when he previously spoke with the sheriff, he was told that engineers from Google were trying to go back into the system and see if any additional data could be recovered. Now, according to new reporting from ABC News and Fox News, investigators have actually managed to retrieve some images from those cameras. But the discovery came with a surprising twist. According to Entin, the cameras in the backyard and along the side of the house were motion activated and pointed toward key areas of the property, including the swimming pool, the backyard, and the side yard. Investigators recently recovered images from those cameras that had been triggered by motion. However, they were not able to recover full video footage. Instead, what detectives managed to pull were thumbnail images, small preview snapshots that the cameras automatically saved whenever motion was detected. "So they don't have the actual video," Entin explained. "But they do have the thumbnails that were captured when the cameras were triggered." At first glance, the images themselves didn't immediately reveal anything suspicious. According to sources who spoke with ABC News, investigators reviewing the images were able to see several people appearing in the backyard and side yard during the days leading up to the abduction. The exact dates and times haven't been made public, but the images show different individuals on the property during that period. Entin pointed out that those people may have completely normal explanations for being there. They could just be contractors, he said. They could be people cleaning the pool or doing work around the house. At this point, investigators have not suggested that those individuals are connected to the crime. Still, the images give detectives something to work with. Investigators can now go back, identify the people captured in the pictures, and determine exactly who they were and why they were on the property. In an investigation like this, even small details can become important later, but the part of this discovery that Entin said stood out the most is what the cameras did not capture. Despite being positioned around the property, the cameras recorded nothing on the night Nancy Guthrie was abducted. No thumbnails, no motion alerts, nothing during the critical window of time when the incident happened. Sources familiar with the investigation told ABC News that investigators have not reached any conclusions about why the cameras failed to capture anything that night. However, one source reportedly described the situation as odd, and that word odd is what immediately caught Entin's attention. Because when you start putting the pieces together, it raises some interesting questions. Entin reminded viewers that a neighbor who lives behind Nancy Guthrie's home had previously told him that two of his own security cameras were also not working properly around the time of the abduction. Those cameras were part of a Google Nest Cameras system. According to the neighbor, both cameras stopped functioning right when the incident was happening. Now, investigators have learned that Nancy's cameras also failed to capture anything during that same time period. That coincidence has led some people to wonder whether something else might have been going on. For example, there were early questions about whether a signal-blocking device might have been used. Some observers noticed what looked like a small antenna sticking out of the suspect's pocket in earlier images. Entin says the more he has spoken with sources and looked into that possibility, the less likely it seems. "I think it was probably a walkie-talkie," he said, referring to the object seen in the suspect's pocket. But the timing of the camera failures is still something that investigators will likely continue to examine. If multiple cameras in the area stopped working at the same time, detectives will want to understand why. Was there an internet outage in the neighborhood? Was it simply a technical malfunction? Or was it something else entirely? At this stage, investigators have not given a definitive answer. What Entin emphasized, though, is that the recovery of these images is still a meaningful step forward in the case. Even if the thumbnails only show activity in the days before the abduction, they could still help detectives piece together the timeline of events. Investigators can analyze who appeared on the property, when they were there, and whether any of those visits stand out. Entin described the investigative process as slowly peeling back layers. Sometimes you start with almost nothing, and then one piece of evidence leads to another. Right now, these newly recovered images are just one more layer being uncovered. And as Entin continues speaking with sources close to the investigation, he says he's working to learn more about what exactly investigators are seeing in those images. Because in a case like this, even a small snapshot from a security camera could eventually become a key clue. From the recovered camera images, who was last with Nancy? And could there be a connection to her disappearance? Keep watching to find out. The man closest to the timeline. Who is Tommaso Cioni? As investigators worked to understand the final hours before Nancy Guthrie disappeared, one name naturally entered the timeline early in the investigation: her son-in-law, Tommaso Cioni. Cioni is married to Nancy's oldest daughter, Annie Guthrie, and the couple shares a young son together. According to available information, Cioni is 50 years old and of Italian descent. He lives with his family in Arizona, not far from Nancy Guthrie's home, which means he was regularly present in her life and familiar with her routines. Because of that closeness, investigators naturally looked at the timeline of the last evening Nancy was seen alive. Authorities confirmed that on the night before her disappearance, Nancy had gone out for dinner with her daughter Annie and Tommaso Cioni. It was described as a normal evening, something families often do, spending time together over a meal before returning home. Later that night, the three left the restaurant, and according to investigators, Cioni drove Nancy back to her house. Officials say Nancy arrived home at approximately 9:30 p.m. local time. Chris Nanos, the sheriff overseeing the investigation, later explained that Cioni didn't simply drop Nancy off and leave immediately. According to Nanos, Cioni made sure she was safely inside her home before he drove away. That detail quickly became part of the official timeline. Speaking to the New York Times, Sheriff Nanos said investigators believe Cioni may have been the last person to see Nancy Guthrie before the events that followed later that night. Sometime during the overnight hours between January 31st and February 1st, authorities believe Nancy may have been kidnapped from her home. Exactly what happened during those hours remains one of the biggest unanswered questions in the case. Because of the timeline, attention naturally turned toward the people who had been with Nancy during her final known moments, including members of her own family. In high-profile investigations like this one, that kind of scrutiny is not unusual. Detectives often begin by carefully examining the movements of those closest to the missing person. It is part of the process investigators use to build an accurate timeline and eliminate possibilities. Still, speculation around the case began to grow. During an episode of her podcast, journalist Ashley Banfield said that a law enforcement source had told her that Tommaso Cioni could be considered a prime suspect in the investigation. The claim quickly spread online and across social media, adding another layer of public attention to the case. However, that information has not been officially confirmed by investigators. Law enforcement authorities have repeatedly emphasized that they have not identified any suspects in Nancy Guthrie's disappearance. No arrests have been made, and investigators say the case remains open while detectives continue gathering information. In a statement provided to TMZ, authorities made their position clear. "We have not identified a suspect or person of interest in this case," the statement said. Detectives, according to the same statement, are continuing to speak with anyone who may have had contact with Nancy before she disappeared. At the same time, investigators are still waiting for additional forensic results that could help clarify what happened. That means the investigation remains in a delicate stage. detectives are still assembling the timeline piece by piece, reviewing evidence, and following every lead that could explain how Nancy vanished after returning home that night. For now, the fact remains that Tommaso Cioni was one of the last known people to see Nancy Guthrie before she disappeared. But investigators have not publicly named him or anyone else as a suspect. Until more evidence emerges, authorities continue to approach the case carefully, focusing on facts rather than speculation. And as detectives continue reviewing evidence and awaiting forensic results, one question continues to drive the investigation forward. What really happened in the hours after Nancy Guthrie walked into her home that night? We may never find out. But could Tommaso Cioni's vehicle hold clues to Nancy's disappearance? Stay tuned to find out. The car that quietly entered the investigation. In investigations like the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie, there often comes a point when detectives begin shifting their focus. Early on, most of the attention is on people, where they were, what they said, and whether their stories line up. But as time passes, investigators begin looking just as closely at something else: the objects connected to those people. Phones, clothing, personal belongings, and sometimes vehicles. Cars move quietly through the story of a crime. They travel from one place to another without drawing much attention. They carry people across town, between homes, or down roads where no one is watching. And sometimes, without the driver even realizing it, they carry something else too. Evidence. That's one of the reasons investigators eventually turned their attention toward a vehicle connected to Nancy Guthrie's family, the car belonging to her son-in-law. At first, the decision to examine the vehicle was simply part of the normal investigative process. When someone close to a missing person becomes part of the timeline surrounding a disappearance, detectives often take a closer look at anything that might confirm where that person was and what they were doing. And vehicles can reveal more than most people realize. To the average person, a car might look perfectly clean. The seats are clear, the trunk is empty, and nothing appears out of place. But to trained forensic teams, a vehicle can hold an incredible amount of hidden information. Even the smallest trace can matter. Fibers from clothing can become trapped deep within seat seams. Microscopic particles from soil or plants can cling to floor mats. Dust, dirt, or pollen can settle into corners that are almost impossible to see with the naked eye. And sometimes there are even smaller clues. Tiny amounts of biological evidence, so small they cannot be seen at all, can remain behind long after someone believes everything has been wiped away. A single hair, a drop of fluid, or even skin cells can linger in places most people would never think to check. That is why forensic investigators approach a vehicle very differently from an ordinary person would. They examine areas most drivers rarely pay attention to: under floor mats, inside storage compartments, around door frames, inside the trunk, and along the tight seams of seats and upholstery. These are the places where evidence can remain hidden long after an object has been removed. So when agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation began examining the son-in-law's car, they weren't just casually looking around. They were carefully searching for details. Not only signs that something might have happened inside that vehicle, but also proof that nothing unusual had ever been there at all. Because in cases like this, the evidence inside a car can move an investigation in two very different directions. If investigators discover something unexpected, a trace of blood, fibers that don't belong, or signs that an object was transported, it can immediately raise serious questions. But sometimes the opposite happens. Sometimes a careful search reveals nothing out of the ordinary at all. And when that happens, it can quietly clear someone from suspicion, allowing detectives to move their attention somewhere else. That's why the examination of this vehicle became such an important moment in the investigation into Nancy Guthrie's disappearance. Detectives had been asking the same question from the very beginning. Was someone close to Nancy involved in what happened to her? Or was the suspicion surrounding the son-in-law leading investigators down the wrong path? The answer might not come from interviews or statements. Instead, it could come from something far quieter, the hidden traces inside a car that had been sitting in plain sight all along. Could the evidence inside the car reveal the truth? Let's find out. The forensic question that could change everything. As laboratory teams continued examining the samples taken from the vehicle, investigators began focusing on one particular possibility that could instantly change the direction of the case: something known as transfer evidence. In forensic investigations, transfer evidence refers to tiny materials that move from one surface to another when contact occurs. It might be something as small as a fiber from a jacket attaching to a car seat. A strand of hair could fall onto a floor mat. Even particles of soil from a specific location can cling to the bottom of a shoe and later end up inside a vehicle. Most of these details are completely invisible to the human eye. But inside a forensic laboratory, they can tell an incredibly detailed story. Specialists working with the Federal Bureau of Investigation began carefully comparing every particle recovered from the son-in-law's car with evidence collected from Nancy Guthrie's home and the surrounding property. They weren't just looking for obvious clues. They were searching for even the smallest possible connection. A single fiber that matched the clothing Nancy had been wearing. Tiny plant fragments that could have come from the environment near her home. Or biological traces that might suggest Nancy had been inside the vehicle at some point during the timeline investigators were examining. If even one of those matches appeared, the implications would be enormous. Because that kind of discovery would suggest the vehicle had been involved in events connected to Nancy's disappearance. And that possibility alone made the laboratory testing one of the most important parts of the entire investigation. But investigators also understood something equally important. The results might show the exact opposite. There was always the possibility that the forensic analysis would reveal no connection at all. If the materials found inside the vehicle failed to match anything from Nancy's home or the area where she was last seen, detectives would have to rethink one of the most widely discussed theories in the case, the idea that the son-in-law's car had played a role in Nancy Guthrie's disappearance. As the testing continued, investigators began preparing for two very different outcomes. Because the results coming from the lab wouldn't just add another detail to the investigation, they had the potential to reshape it entirely. If something inside the vehicle matched evidence connected to Nancy, detectives would immediately begin asking new questions. How did that material get there? Was Nancy ever inside the car? Could an object connected to her have been transported in it? And most importantly, what would that mean about the people closest to her? But investigators were also ready for another possibility. The laboratory could return results showing nothing that linked the vehicle to Nancy at all. No fibers connected to her clothing. No biological traces. No soil, plant fragments, or environmental particles matched the area where she disappeared. If that happened, the conclusion would be very different. It would strongly suggest that the vehicle had no role in whatever happened that night. And that outcome would quietly remove one of the most discussed suspicions surrounding the case. In high-profile investigations, the people closest to the victim are almost always examined first. Not because detectives automatically believe they are responsible, but because investigators must eliminate every possibility before they can move forward with confidence. That process often means asking difficult questions and examining the lives of those nearest to the victim. In this case, the vehicle belonging to Nancy Guthrie's son-in-law became one of the key pieces of evidence that investigators needed to evaluate, because a car can tell a story without anyone saying a word. The materials hidden inside it can reveal where it has been, who may have entered it, and sometimes even what may have been transported in it. That's why the evidence recovered from that vehicle carried such enormous weight. If the laboratory discovered something linking the car to Nancy, suspicion around the son-in-law would intensify immediately. But if the results showed no connection at all, it could quietly clear his name and force detectives to search somewhere else entirely for answers. As the forensic testing continued, investigators knew they were approaching one of the most critical moments in the entire Nancy Guthrie investigation. Because laboratory evidence does something powerful in criminal cases. It removes speculation. Up until that point, much of the discussion surrounding the vehicle had been built on questions. Why was the car important? Could it have been used during the time Nancy disappeared? Was it possible that something connected to Nancy had been inside it? Those questions had been circulating for weeks. But forensic science has a way of turning questions into answers. Once the laboratory results were complete, investigators would finally know whether the vehicle contained even the smallest trace linking it to Nancy Guthrie. And whatever those results revealed, they were almost certain to change the direction of the investigation. How will the lab results reshape the investigation's direction? Keep watching to find out. The evidence that could change the entire case. Inside the laboratory, analysts began the slow and meticulous process of examining the materials collected from the vehicle. Nothing was rushed. Every piece of potential evidence was handled carefully, because even the smallest mistake could affect the results. In investigations like this, details matter, and sometimes the tiniest fragment can carry the biggest meaning. Each fiber recovered from the vehicle was placed under magnification and studied closely. Analysts looked at color, texture, and structure, comparing those fibers with samples investigators had already collected from Nancy Guthrie's home. At the same time, tiny particles of dust and soil were examined and compared with environmental samples gathered earlier by investigators from areas surrounding the property. Even the smallest biological traces were carefully processed. Using advanced DNA analysis techniques, laboratory specialists searched for microscopic skin cells that might have been left behind through brief contact. Sometimes a person does not even realize they have left evidence behind. A quick touch, a moment of contact with a seat or door handle, can leave biological material that remains long after someone has walked away. The process of analyzing these samples takes time. Sometimes it takes days. In more complicated cases, it can take weeks. Laboratories must confirm their findings carefully before investigators can rely on them. Every test is repeated, every result checked again, because the conclusions drawn from that evidence can shape the direction of an entire investigation. And detectives working the Nancy Guthrie case understood exactly how important those laboratory results could be. If the analysis showed that something connected to Nancy Guthrie had been inside the vehicle, the implications would be impossible to ignore. That kind of discovery would suggest the car had been present during events linked to her disappearance. Such a finding would immediately raise new questions. How did that connection happen? When had Nancy, or something belonging to her, been inside the vehicle? And what did that mean about the timeline investigators had been working to build since the moment she vanished? If that type of evidence appeared, investigators would almost certainly intensify their focus on the son-in-law and his movements during the hours surrounding Nancy's disappearance. Detectives would begin reconstructing the timeline again, step by step. Where had the vehicle traveled during that time? Who had access to it? And were there surveillance cameras, traffic cameras, or digital records that could confirm those movements? Vehicles often leave quiet trails behind them. Security cameras, parking records, and even digital data can sometimes reveal where a car has been, even when no one remembers seeing it. But investigators also had to prepare for another possibility. The laboratory results might reveal no connection between the vehicle and Nancy Guthrie at all. There might be no matching fibers, no biological traces, and no environmental evidence linking the car to locations investigators had been studying. If that happened, something equally significant would take place. The theory surrounding the son-in-law's vehicle would begin to weaken. Because forensic evidence is not only about proving involvement. Just as often, it is about ruling people out. If the vehicle showed no signs that Nancy or anything connected to her disappearance had ever been inside it, detectives would have to reconsider the role that the car played in the case. And that realization would force investigators to shift their attention somewhere else. Toward other leads, toward other timelines, toward other individuals who may have crossed paths with Nancy during the hours before she vanished. That is why investigators understood the weight carried by those laboratory results. They were not simply testing samples from a vehicle. They were examining evidence that had the power to reshape the entire investigation. The findings could strengthen suspicion around someone close to the family, or they could quietly clear one of the most discussed figures in the case. What if tiny traces in the car reveal Nancy's fate? Stay tuned to find out more. Traces in the car, a critical piece of the puzzle. Until those results were fully confirmed, however, one question remained hanging over the entire investigation. What exactly had investigators from the Federal Bureau of Investigation discovered inside that vehicle? And what would it ultimately reveal about the night Nancy Guthrie disappeared? By the time investigators completed the forensic examination of Nancy Guthrie's son-in-law's car, the vehicle had quietly become one of the most important pieces of the entire investigation. Not because a car can directly explain what happened, but because vehicles often carry the smallest fragments of a story. Fragments that people rarely realize they leave behind. Fibers caught deep within seat seams. Particles of soil pressed into the floor mats. Microscopic traces that remain long after someone believes everything has been cleaned away. This is exactly why forensic teams approach the vehicle with such extreme care. Every section of the car was documented. Every surface was examined. Every particle that could possibly hold information was collected and sent for further analysis. In disappearance cases, vehicles can sometimes reveal movements that investigators cannot see anywhere else. They can hint at where someone may have traveled, what objects may have been transported, and whether something connected to the missing person ever passed through that space. For detectives working the Nancy Guthrie investigation, the search of the son-in-law's vehicle was never about discovering a single dramatic clue. It was about narrowing the truth. Investigations often begin with many possibilities, different theories, different timelines, different people who may have interacted with the victim before they disappeared. But as evidence begins to surface, those possibilities slowly start to shrink. Certain theories collapse. Others begin to grow stronger. The vehicle search was simply one part of that process. If forensic testing uncovered traces connected to Nancy inside the car, investigators would immediately begin rebuilding the timeline around that discovery. They would analyze when the vehicle had been used, where it may have traveled, and whether any surveillance cameras, digital records, or witness statements could confirm those movements. Evidence like that could dramatically shift the direction of the case. But detectives were equally prepared for a completely different outcome. The possibility that the vehicle contained nothing connected to Nancy at all. No fibers, no biological traces, no environmental materials linked the car to locations investigators had been studying. If that happened, the theory surrounding the son-in-law's vehicle would slowly begin to fade. Because forensic evidence does not only identify suspects, it can also eliminate them. Removing someone from suspicion allows investigators to focus their attention elsewhere, toward other people, other locations, and other moments in the timeline that may not have received enough attention before. That is the difficult reality of investigations like this. The truth rarely appears all at once. Instead, it emerges slowly. One piece of evidence at a time. For now, the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie remains a mystery that investigators are still working to solve. Detectives continue reviewing forensic reports, examining digital data, and following leads that might explain what happened during the critical hours before Nancy vanished. And somewhere within that growing collection of evidence lies the answer everyone has been searching for. Did the discovery inside the son-in-law's vehicle reveal the connection investigators were looking for? Or will the case ultimately lead detectives somewhere completely unexpected? Until those answers become clear, the investigation continues. And with every new piece of evidence, investigators move one step closer to understanding what truly happened the night Nancy Guthrie disappeared. So, what do you think about Brian Entin's revelation regarding Nancy Guthrie's disappearance? And do you think Nancy's son-in-law could be somehow involved in this case? What if they find something linking him to the case in his car? Let us know in the comments section below. Nancy Guthrie's disappearance shows just how complex real-life investigations can be. With Brian Entin breaking down new CCTV footage and forensic evidence, every detail could shift the case in a major way. If this story grabbed your attention, like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. Stay tuned for the next video to follow the latest twists in this intense investigation.